Okay, so the solar system, of course, there are many solar systems that exist in our universe, but essentially our solar system, which we're going to be focusing on, of course, is the one that we know the most information about because obviously the different celestial bodies are much closer to us than other solar systems are. So typically a solar system, I mentioned this before, has you typically a star or plural stars that are at the center of it and have typically planets or other celestial objects that are orbiting around it. So our solar system, of course, is made up of the sun and all of the planets, all of the asteroids, comets, everything that happens to be within our certain amount of distance from the sun. Okay, so you can see the planets here. So we have Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. So Pluto was declared as a dwarf planet. It got kind of demoted from a planet typically from the fact that its orbit actually crossed over Neptune's. So what ends up happening is a planet essentially should have its own orbit around the star or the sun. So because Pluto's crosses over at some point over Neptune's, they demoted it. However, more recently, they've actually promoted it back to being planet status. I'm not 100% sure that when that occurred, but because of its size and its gravitational pull, they do believe that it still kind of deserves a planet status. Okay, so for us, it's very recent that that occurred. So you can think of it as a planet, but because it is much smaller than other planets, it is called a dwarf planet. Okay, so here you go. So a planet is a sphere-shaped object that has a certain path or orbit that it follows around a star. Some planets have objects that will revolve around them, which are called satellites. So satellites is really anything that is orbiting a planet. Now, satellites can be natural, such as moons, but satellites, of course, especially on Earth, we have many artificial satellites that are traveling around the Earth that are essentially sending data and satellite information from one part of the world to another, right? Part of telecommunications and all that. Okay, so our solar system consists of the following. So we've already mentioned these, but the order to remember the planets in, it's kind of like a little acronym to kind of help you out. My very excellent mother just sent us nachos. So that's Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. Okay, so the difference between, of course, a star and a planet, we know that planets are not luminous. A star is luminous. And of course, a planet will orbit around a star. So stars create a ton of light, a ton of heat, and of course, different planets will receive different amounts of that light and heat depending on the distance that it is away from the sun. So we're going to spend a whole day. Actually, there's a nice gizmo activity about planets where you'll look at the distance and how it's impacting the temperature on those planets. Okay, so just some differences between stars and planets. So we've already mentioned a lot of these along the way. So planets are in the solar systems and technically stars are classified as being in the universe. So a star does not necessarily have to have planets around it. There are many, many different stars within the universe, many, many different galaxies, which we will get into later on. Planets typically appear to be bigger, but that's just simply because we are closer to them. The sun is actually quite a distance away from us, so that's why it appears smaller, not because it is smaller. We'll look at size later on in this unit. Right, so planets reflect light, they're non-luminous, and stars emit their own light, right? Planets are typically cold, stars are giving off heat. The only reason why a planet may be warm is because it's absorbing energy from the star, not because it has its own energy. Planets can be made out of rock, You can have planets made out of gas. That is not 100%, that statement's not 100% true. You can have a planet that is gaseous. For example, Saturn, Uranus, Jupiter, those are all gaseous planets. And planets will essentially move throughout constellations, whereas stars only move with a constellation. So planets are essentially revolving around a star. If we are seeing a constellation move, it is actually because we are moving. So that's called apparent movement, which we will talk about later on as well. Okay, so that's it for this introduction lesson. For today's homework, you're going to be doing a vocabulary sheet, which is essentially going to give you a nice overview of the terminology that we learned here already. And it's going to have you look into some other terms that we're going to be talking about in the remainder of this unit.